not discounting that America has never allowed wars to be conducted on their land. The wars must be in Vietnam, there must be in Cuba,
Afghanistan.
There must be in Afghanistan, in Iraq. And the fear of having Russia in Cuba was that the war would then come to Miami and then it would be right in your house. But when America does the very same thing, word for word, that they want to move their missiles through NATO, and this allowing Ukraine to become a member of NATO in words.
This is the journey to one Africa.
Good morning, Africa and Africans, wherever you are in this wide world. I'm happy this morning to be in the company of my dear brother, King Maponga, all the way from the southern part of Africa, not too far from the Cape of Good Hope. Welcome.
Karibu. Karibu, asante sana. I was in Zambia for the past few days.
Thank you.
For the festivities of the indigenous people there, the Lubinda Ndongo, the Lubinda in the Zambezi, and celebrations were high. Quite an interesting space to see the amalgamation of African cultures and people finding each other. And of most exciting experience for me was the Ngoni, dancing the Ngoni, related of course to the Nguni in the south. And while they were doing their Ngoni dance, 10, 15 minutes, the last song was a killer. Then they were singing their Ngoni choreography, but they started singing the Lunda dance, you know, that dance for the ladies and stuff like that.
And you appear to have the moves.
And while they were dancing,
yeah,
then the Lunda girls came in, the Lozis came in, and the Ngoni. It was such a beautiful, seamless transition where one culture is expressing itself in another language, yet in another dance. And in another
and you're seeking that to me is Africa. That Africa is in many ways the most diverse, the most heterogeneous continent on earth, and yet it is the one that has things that connect her, and that legitimizes her claim to be the cradle of mankind. And that is why when one has a conversation of this kind, one asks, but when did the rain start beating us? And how can we then reverse the situation? And it's Nigeria's Chinua Achebe who said, until the day that you know when the rain started beating you, you cannot know when you started drying. And that then leads us to the next question.
Now, before we go to the next question, that for me is an intelligent observation, because the formation and rhythm combination of language, drum, dance, people, culture, and fashion becomes the blueprint through which local politics, international politics, if we miss that heterogeneous fruit salad, independence of each, interdependence of all. In our individuality, we don't war each other. We come together. I mean, we can get into Europe. We can get into the Caribbean. We can get into Africa. We can get into the oceanic space until we begin to find the common heartbeat of the drum within the diversity of our languages and fashion. We may think that we're enemies of each other, yet the symbiosis that we find in the drum should be that which directs the politics of the world. I mean, looking at Russia and Ukraine, you're looking at America and the Southern America, you're looking at Africa as a whole. I think we're missing that heartbeat of unity and places of common convergence.
And you remember I talked about the next question. This morning, I was reading or rereading Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And Walter was writing all the way from Guyana. And he had looked at how the European model, and this model starts in earnest with the exploration, with the expedition, culminating in what we have talked about ad nauseum, the Berlin Conference. And it is at Berlin that Africa is actually, not in so many words, designated as a hunting ground. You take your bit, you Germans have your bit, you Italians your bit, you Belgians have you English have your bit, you Italians have your bit, you Germans have your bit, you French have your bit. And from that day, Africa has never been the same again. The beauty that you've described, the symbiosis that you've described, almost disappears. And the grand agenda, as it were, is by the British. They come up with divide and conquer. And our literature in the 1950s, when Chinua writes at age 22, writes his Things Fall Apart, he says the white man was clever. He brought a knife and cut the things that held us together so that we forgot our gods, we forgot our culture, we forgot our everything. And one sees almost something that may be described as déjà vu. Many years after that, that Africa is still a victim of the original sin that was planted in Berlin in 1884 and 1885.
While you are emphasizing on that, I've asked a question which has not been answered to date. That how can 10 to 15 white men sit on a table and make an agreement which 54 presidents and leaders cannot undo? What is it that such a small group of united Europeans can take a ruler and cut your continent to pieces? Here we are 63 years later talking about the Africa Union and Kwame Nkrumah's vision, Kambarage's vision, Kenneth Kaunda's have come and gone, Banda's have come and gone, Mugabe's have come and gone. And what makes it so sad is that during the liberation struggle, Tanzania becomes a home base for all of them. ANC, SWAPO, ZANU-PF, Frelimo, all of them, they were in the same camp. They all were agreeing as comrades, let's go back and liberate our countries. But immediately all of them go back to their countries. They've become enemies of each other. So are we only friends at war and we're enemies at peace? And if we can fail, therefore, as African governments in this déjà vu of what we lost, over and above the culture that Chinua Achebe can echo, now we're talking about the loss of even the unity. That became the fuel of our own independence. I mean, I can't imagine ZANU-PF, for example, and the ANC looking at the amount of animosity between Zimbabwe and South Africa, particularly in the health sector, and this whole thing of Dudula pulling each other out of hospital lines and pulling out drips from women that are in hospital because they don't have citizenships and all this, without necessarily pontificating or making it a good practice of jumping borders without clearances. But here you have the two political parties, who are not opposition parties, but ruling parties, who can meet anywhere else for a conference, except we've never heard of a public meeting where ANC and ZANU-PF can come together. ANC and Frelimo and ZANU-PF and SWAPO can have a conference of, can we revisit, Morogoro?
But King, let's trace it. In 1963, in Addis Ababa, the question of undoing Berlin was a live issue. And if you look at the early debates, there are those who said, let us undo the boundaries. And then it was examined, and they argued that if we started undoing the boundaries, there would be great conflict because the neo-colonizer is still with us. The same was revisited in Cairo in 1964. Hosted by Gamal Abdel Nasser. And the key voices at that time were Nyerere and Nkrumah. Nkrumah believed that these boundaries were temporary because Africa was going to unite anyway. So his argument was, well, these are only going to be boundaries for purposes of administration, and the doctrine of inviolability of inherited boundaries was then drilled down. Little did he know that these were the things that were going to be gridlock and paddocks that would hold us together. So in 1965, when he convenes a meeting in Accra, he himself takes the view, and Nyerere speaks about it on 6th of March 1997. He says that they thought that they would come out of that meeting saying there is a United States of Africa. But the neo-colonizer was thinking differently, and a year later Nkrumah is overthrown. But Nkrumah said something that answers your question. He said that it will be easy to do away with the colonizer as the political leader. We may even solve our economic problem, but there is something that happened to our minds. And that is going to take a little longer to deal with. And he was echoing a statement that had been made in 1933 by an African-American, Carter G. Woodson, the miseducation of the Negro.
African.
And Ngugi wa Thiong'o later writes about it in terms of decolonizing the mind. And I
Brilliant book, by the way.
Yes, indeed.
And I think while you're on that,
yes,
it should be illegal for anyone who wants to start talking Pan-Africanism, for example, who has not gone through 2 or 3 of those books that you have mentioned. How the African,
how Europe
civilized the world. There's one also how the African civilized Europe, and how Europe, uncivilized Africa, so to speak. And the Chinua Achebe, great work, Things Fall Apart, and Decolonization of the Mind by Ngugi, and Steve Biko also, I Write What I Like.
I think, yes.
And I think if you can put a nice little catalog.
And Anta-Check Diop.
Yes, of course.
Anta-Check Diop, really, those must be compulsory readings. And to remove, there is also, and there is no harm in that, but there is too much romanticization of Pan-Africanism without looking at the practical Pan-Africanism.
Obligation, yeah.
So I think what those books do is to drill down. There is another one that I would want to put on the list. This is Adekeye Adebayo, Africa After the Cold War, The Curse of Berlin.
But for the lighter readers, of course, the economic hitman.
Yes.
Then you begin to have a peep through. But I wanted to compare very, 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 in a dialogue. The dialogue between the Berlin Convention, its history. What I think was lacking even in those conferences was the African identity, Ubuntu, whatever you might want to call it, as a central place of meeting, so that in our fragmentation we don't lose each other's faces. Go back in my theological days when I was taught about the rise of the Roman Empire in one of my undergraduate studies, where Rome, when it broke apart in the reign of Caesar, then it went into the 4 pieces, the Calasanders, Las Marcas, Ptolemy, and etc. And then further on broke apart to the Sueves, the Alemanis, the Germans, the Francophones, the Anglophones, the Herulis, the Burgundians, the Vandals, the Ostrogoths, to form what we call Europe now. The difference between their division and African division is that Romanism remained at the center of their division, so to speak. It must sound like a contradiction of terms. But when the European Union finally seeks for a common convergence into the euro dollar or the European money, when they begin to talk about foreign policy, when they begin to protect their own sovereignty, Europe has then subtly oneness in the midst of their Italian, French. Of course, the French call the British the dogs, this one called this one frogs. But when an African comes as an enemy, they quickly forget the dogs and the frogs, and they can unite over a problem. Come to Africa. The opposite seems to happen. We don't seem to think that what happened in the 52 states in America, what happened in the states in Europe, what happened in the villages and the tribes of Asia, the villages and tribes of China, could become a possibility. You walk through social media, you actually have propagators. Every time you put something positive about the unity of Africa, I bet you 2/3 of the comments are those that are telling you that it can't happen. It will not happen. Some have legitimate reasons why that can't happen, but I fail to find what makes you think that it cannot happen in Africa when we already have the American flag with all those, when you have the European flags with all those different political, linguistic, country sort of individuality, but they could find a common convergence of function so that they can become one voice. In conclusion, the American policy and the European policy, when it comes to Africa, it is an isolated dealing with each piece. It's not a holistic policy. So when you find the American policy on Guinea-Bissau and the American policy on Zimbabwe or the American policy on South Africa, I bet you think that you are reading 3, 4, 5 different pieces of paper, because the Djibouti one has their interest in terms of looking after this part of the territory. The Zimbabwean one could have a variation. So in them dealing with us as individuals, we have lost the homogeneous focus of dealing with American policy, particularly when it comes to African, because it is not one shoe fits all. And therefore we needed to look at the Berlin Conference and its impact post the propagators of it in the hands of the neo-colonizers who now come into office to implement, manage, and drive the same process which was oppressing them, vis-a-vis the breakages of Europe, helping them to come up with their division and creating a mega economic structure through which they can continuously push the agenda.
But I want us to move to a lot more contemporary, and I want to lay a basis for it. You see, the neo-colonizer in his diabolical machinations was very clever. All of them. The British had created long ago something called the Commonwealth.
Which is common poverty.
Which is headquartered in London. They even tell you that your ambassadors are no longer ambassadors, they are high commissioners. The French have also created their La Francophonie, headquartered in Paris. And they tell you, of course, you are Francophone, the others are Anglophone. The weak Portuguese, without as much gusto after the Carnation Revolution in 1974, are not saying as much, but there is something called the Organization of Portuguese-Speaking Countries. And you belong to it. And of course, the Belgians, in their own way, have also created something that makes the Congolese true north to be Brussels. So we all look to Lisbon, Portugal. We look to Paris. We look to London. And we are happy to be called Lusophone, Anglophone, Francophone. And in that way, our elite are then geared towards seeking approval and even defining your policy on the basis of the neo-colonizer. And that, I think, is something that has continued to date, so that when the Americans come into the fray, and remember the Americans were not your classical colonizers, particularly as regards the continent of Africa. But when they meet, and this is what brings me to an iconic meeting, which we never talk about as much as we should, which takes place in Crimea, in Yalta. That meeting that is attended by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, is attended by Joseph Stalin, and attended by Winston Churchill. These are the victors over Germany. And the Soviet Union at that time is a powerhouse. And of course, the British is not a powerhouse. But
the Commonwealth impact was...
The Commonwealth is already there. The Americans and the new kid in the block. And after that, you go to San Francisco and create the United Nations, and you say that the architecture of this particular outfit is that you have all these members. The Africans are not there. They are still under the colonial yoke. And when you do that, you say, we'll have the 5 permanent members. Is it 5 of them? And we have veto power. The Americans now become a hegemon. And they begin to define policy in many ways. And that does change the equation, because the rest of Europe, particularly Western Europe, operates at the behest of the United States of America. Of course, the Soviet Union also has its own client states in Eastern Europe, and African freedom fighters are also gravitating toward the Soviet Union for obvious ideological reasons in those early days. Africa then goes through this phase of what I call a split personality. A split personality in the sense that you want to do dalliance with the Americans and the West, but if they don't play ball, you have the Soviet Union on this hand, and that schizophrenia continues until the collapse of the Berlin Wall, during which Europe and America now tell us that there is something called democracy. And that thing called democracy demands that you have multi-party politics. It demands that you must have something that we call human rights, which we define. It demands that you must have two-term limit, which we define. It demands that your economies must change, and the IMF and World Bank are telling you what to do. We have the WTO rule, and if you behave in a manner that we don't
bring
accept,
you to the table.
Then we sanction you. We no longer are going to trade with you. And Africa finds herself in that space with the consequence that when the structural adjustment systems, the structural adjustment programs fail lamentably, they fail lamentably, we now find our economies are not growing. So we have two organizations that are telling us what to do. Moody tells us how moody our currencies are, and McKinsey tells us how badly our economies are failing. And of course, the World Bank and the IMF are there to give us the occasional dole. Now, that is where we are, with the consequence now that we are being summoned periodically to go to this or that capital. And if you look beneath that, Walter Rodney remains so very relevant, so that the title can only change if you tweak it a little, not how Europe underdeveloped Africa, but how Europe is continuing to underdevelop Africa.
On that, I would like to reflect this concept of forming up of the United Nations, but without meaningfully involving other nations. But you still call them nations anyway. And if you look at through the liberation movements, one of the epitome achievements was to have your government represented on the United Nations. There was some aura around, we are now also aligning. And I think the African thought that by aligning themselves with the colonial system will become sympathetic towards their pain, only to end up walking into the trap where the WTO, IMF, World Bank will then give you loans, which have unreasonable interests in some certain cases, even when they knew that you have no capacity to pay back those loans. They still give you the loans anyway, and then they junk your state, they junk your currency. But once that happens, then the export of your raw material escalates to figures that you can understand. So it's almost like you devalue a country in terms of their currency, then you can take anything that you want from that country for almost next to nothing. Having looked at that ideology as it plays itself into the African political space, I doubt if our modern politician, a taxi driver, a teacher, or a wannabe businessman who makes their way into politics, either as a minister or as a president, really have the in-depth understanding of the machinery, the democratic or demon-crazy machinery, the financial monster managing machinery, the cyber now in our generation, the surveillances, the invasions of Israeli military intelligence and CIAs into economies, the movement of prisoners, criminals into the space, the pharmaceutical knowledge, the vaccinations, the MNR, the COVID, the complexity of this political monster, which you want to sit in your office and say, I am the legitimate leader of this country. And I watch sometimes with disdain, anger, almost with revulsion. When our presidents walk into these countries where they are summoned, you arrive there on Wednesday evening, you are signing papers on Thursday morning. And I wonder if they've really applied their minds to the signing of these papers as to what does it entail. That we can be producing so much steel to date, yet we can't produce a car. We can produce so much lithium, yet we can't produce a battery. We are producing so much gold, yet our currency is worth nothing. You're producing so much diamonds, yet tomorrow inflation is on your table. What is it that we have signed? No, we signed actually that we have bilateral agreements. What are these bilateral agreements that you continuously give us raw material and we'll produce the final product and we'll send it back to you?
Somebody once said that we are playing rugby under the rules of football.
There you go.
And we are making fouls every minute. And I think that that is the tragedy. And that brings us to one of the things that you've mentioned now. We had the First World War, we had the Second World War, and there is something that I call a creeping Third World War. And that makes me segue into what is happening currently.
Take us to Russia. Take us to Russia and American conversation.
The collapse of the Soviet Union and the emergence of the Russian Federation as a counterweight, because in my view, the Russian Federation militarily is the counterweight to the United States of America. You can't joke with it because you don't know what is in the arsenal. So you can see that and contextualize this within a number of things. One, the Cuban crisis in the 1960s, when the Americans nearly went to war with the Soviet Union because we cannot have a military power outside 90 miles from our
is that your doorstep? Is that your doorstep?
Yeah. Those were the words. Then when the Soviet Union collapses and there are meetings held in 1990 and they convince Mikhail Gorbachev at that time saying, not an inch to the east, they are saying so. Of course, they now argue it was not documented. Then we see in the recent past the creeping of NATO and its allies towards Russia. And with the active invitation of the former states in the Soviet Union to join the EU and by extension NATO, you are now bringing missiles literally
to the doorstep.
At the doorsteps of
and
Russia.
While you're on that, Professor,
yeah.
And for the younger politician, this for me must be crystal clear. What happens on the left must also happen on the right.
As it should be.
And when the war in Ukraine was cracking up, I saw flags, people saying, I am for Ukraine, I am for America. Of course, based on propaganda, that Ukraine is a sovereign state. They must also be allowed to rule themselves and govern, blah, 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 blah. And America was pushing that agenda that the whole world must stand with Ukraine to legitimize their war with Russia. Of course, not discounting that America has never allowed wars to be conducted on their land. The wars must be in Vietnam, they must be in Cuba,
Afghanistan.
They must be in Afghanistan, in Iraq. And the fear of having Russia in Cuba was that the war would then come to Miami and then it would be right in your house. But when America does the very same thing, word for word, that they want to move their missiles through NATO, and this allowing Ukraine to become a member of NATO in words, but in practical, it then creates a problem for Russia. But in the backdrop of that, still we want to set up our military camp in Ukraine so that we can manage St. Petersburg and Moscow from a close distance. When Russia resists this habit, the whole propaganda or world that is full of propaganda of the West, they want to shout at Russia that you can't be doing this. Give Ukraine their sovereignty. The day I will think America is serious, the day they lift up their sanctions on Cuba. Because you're still torturing Cuba to date on the basis of Russia. What makes you think that Russia does not have the same right to torture Ukraine on the basis of America?
On that torture basis, there is a meeting that is taking place on the 15th of August,
give us some few notes.
2025 in Anchorage, Alaska. And we know also
in the Cold War.
And we also know
there's another war
who originally owned Alaska.
And there's another war breeding. There's another war breeding over the occupation of Alaska.
You know, King, I know that meeting is going to be attended by President Trump and President Putin. If I was allowed a little latitude, the missing person there is Deng Xiaoping. For it to be complete and for it to be Yalta in Crimea in 1945.
But you don't think that China will be a fly on the wall?
You never know. but one, I want to imagine. I'm not a Jewish prophet nor a prophet of any description. But I want to imagine what will happen on that day. And I think I'm now going into what I call the sea of speculation, a lot of sharks and piranhas. But I want to understand what, Vladimir Putin listens a lot more than he talks. But I want to imagine what Trump will be saying. See, he possibly will be saying, you remember I came on the basis of a president who is going to stop the war within 24 hours? I came on the basis that I'm a president who is going to collaborate with Russia. Even I'm on record as having said that President Putin and Russia is good to do business with. But you are not allowing me to have my day in glory by continuing the war. What do you think Vladimir Putin will say in answer?
Putin being a chess player,
yes,
and being a martial art expert, Putin being an FBI, I think he's got a few badges on his collar.
Yes,
I cannot use the same for Trump.
Yes,
of course, give him his flowers. A shrewd businessman, an entertainer, a property mogul, an ex-presidential or president with an experience around the systems and militarization of America. Of course, having run one of the biggest countries in the world twice. Just big CV also on his part. But when it comes to etiquette, intelligence, it's almost like Zelensky trying to fight with Putin.
Yes.
You have an entertainer who is in tight shorts and pants, who assumes a role that is political, thinking you can run intelligence. These things are not inherited. There's an intelligence that goes behind it. I pity the involvement of Trump and Putin in the same room. It's a mismatch. If a military general and an intelligence person who's going to be talking to a business person, Trump's agenda, this is my own assumption, it's a business, America great again, propaganda or ideology. And how is he going to do this? It's militarization, manufacturing and supporting the weapons, sales around the world, activating a few wars, and allowing his military equipment to be sold around the world in the backdrop.
But hold your thought. It has already been floated in advance of the meeting that his camp, the Trump camp, is saying that there must be concessions, that territory could be swapped or conceded or ceded. And the Ukrainians via Zelensky have said, not 1 inch, we are not going into that kind of trade. And Trump is as unpredictable can be, but he also wants to succeed.
Professor, count me on this one and read my lips. The day when Israel bombed Gaza, we all anticipated, as the war escalated into Iran, we crossed our fingers that, Lord, help us. If Israel, Gaza, Iran war, should Russia come into the space, we're looking at an explosion of the World War III. What makes you think that the negotiations this time around are not on Ukraine? Because if Russia stood off on Iran and gave America their floor to redistribute Gaza and redetermine the policies of nuclear manufacturing in the Iran space. Now, the bone of contention here, it's unfortunate. You're discussing Ukraine without Ukraine being there. Of course, Ukraine must now feel the pinch, or everyone else must feel the pinch, that when your agenda items are being discussed in your absence, how does it feel? As much as Africans, of course, every time they're discussing the economy of Africa, the African is not there. We just see the impact after that. So I think the real cherry on the cake will be, what will Putin say to Trump in terms of leave Ukraine alone? I also gave you Gaza. I gave you Iran to yourself. Why can't you just give me a space? So the swapping of territories, I think you're quite right. And America must be deciding where else do they take this war to.
But let's look at Europe. You know, Europe has been what it has been, but its fortunes are dwindling, even if they want to say otherwise. whether they come as France, whether they come as Germany, whether they come as Great Britain, which is no longer so great, and whether they come as the Spaniards, their fortunes are dwindling. They are saying there is a big party in Alaska, in Anchorage, and we are not invited.
That party.
And the war that we are talking about is actually in what we call the continent of Europe. How do you imagine the spirits are in Brussels?
The scramble for Africa was a sideliner. And I think Russia and America and Greenland
Yes.
Policies were left in limbo for quite a long time, with the Atlantic Wall, which speaks of the Atlantica and the conspiracies that go beyond the ice wall, unexplored. This was what Maseka's statement, that America sidelined us, that we are going to the moon, we are going to Mars. And while people are looking to disappear to Mars, you can't even cross an ice wall that is right here next to Russia. No one has gone across that line.
Absolutely.
But you are telling me you can go millions of miles away into the sky, which for me, even I still doubt if people ever went to the moon anyway.
The moon landing thing, there is a debate there.
Who was taking the picture?
The moon landing thing. Let's come
So
back.
the scramble for Iceland and the scramble for this snow world.
Yes.
With I heard there millions and tons of gold, uranium. It breaks the whole thing of poverty if we are supposed to count it in terms of gold. Because if there's so much gold and uranium and materials that are there, why are we fighting over crumbs in Africa? So, and in my own space, I think it's a glorious moment where slowly, without being immediate, that the opening up of these ice walls and the opening up of these ice lands and the resources therein that are there, maybe Europe for once will start saying we can find our resources elsewhere. The only problem for Africa is where will we put our raw materials if we do not start converting them into factories, into machineries, into manufacturing the products that we want. So that we needed to create an African domestic market, which then consumes, because if Atlantic opens up with the opportunity that it has, this whole raw mineral story that we are gloating about, what if the European world will start finding its raw materials elsewhere? What are we going to say with all these minerals we have been gloating? Africa has raw materials.
But King, I want to return you to Anchorage, Alaska on 15th. We have Putin. We have Trump. One would have imagined that even the Secretary General of the United Nations
Should have been there.
Should have a seat. One would have imagined that the African Union would have a seat. One would have imagined, for completeness,
China.
that China
Or BRICS.
would be there. One would have imagined that the Brussels government would also be represented. One would even have imagined that from the Arab world, which has been very active as midwives.
This is the United Nations, the real United Nations meeting.
Is the meeting, will the meeting be incomplete?
The meeting, I think, looking at the arrogance of Trump and not willing to be embarrassed in front of many, he would rather contain. I mean, he has been having these one-on-one meetings. It's almost a trend, from Zelensky to Ramaphosa to the other few presidents. He goes one-on-one. I think it's a strategy that he is using, this dialogue between two. Then he's got a chance to privately either embarrass you or make pronouncements and then tweet you around and stuff like that. So he's meeting with Putin, as you said initially. I think he goes there to redeem his face over the promises that he has made, but also looking maybe in the next few years of his term, what sort of strategic partnership can Russia play with him so as to allow him a gentle exit as a man who will have accomplished.
But in order, I'm thinking ahead of
the meeting.
Of the meeting. So I'm imagining they come up with a resolution which is a Trump-Putin arrangement, a communique is issued. And I'm imagining to myself, in order for it to be bought by the
rest of the world,
for the rest of the world, do I see them now asking the UN to convene an urgent meeting to come up with a UN resolution, a binding UN resolution? Do you see that?
What is happening, this is the proper lobbying of the United Nations, knowing fully well that America has withdrawn support of the WHO and some of their funding for the United Nations, that if ever you have an agenda in the United Nations, fund it yourself. If you have an agenda for World Health Organization, fund it yourself. So if the meeting between Putin and Trump has the conclusions that they desire, most likely they will veto themselves into the United Nations. Though Putin is outside of the United Nations, so to speak, but on the Security Council, so 2 members of the Security Council already sit to decide the strategic placement of their weapons around the world and possibly avoid the conflict between the 2 of them. Because I think the conflict between Russia and America being fought in Ukraine, and it's unfair that Zelensky can become so stupid, sorry for my language, that you allow 2 big bulldogs to come and have a war on your doorsteps and vandalize your homestead to nothing. And at the end of the day, you end up not married to any one of them.
But remember, this meeting is also coming so close to the 50-day deadline. You remember there was some kind of deadline that emanated from Trump. He said that within 50 days something will have happened. The Russian must have done this. Of course, he hasn't told us what he will do, but his favorite weapon is the weapon called tariffs. This is the
he was breathing fire. He was breathing fire 2 days ago, actually, when he was saying if Russia does not. And again, this is I don't understand the maverick nature of Trump's administration. I mean, he threatens you, then calls you to a meeting, and then he insults you after that. I mean, he was saying there will be dire consequences.
It's called gunboat diplomacy.
Yeah, there will be dire consequences if Putin does not comply to what. Now, how do you threaten me? And knowing Putin the way I've studied or maybe understood him for the longest of time, and there's a martial arts specialist, you would say the one who strikes first usually loses.
But is it not possible, King, that when he has done that, there's a red-hot telephone which says, "Don't ever worry about what I said in public. It's for my constituencies." There's a possibility that happens.
This is where intelligence plays into the hands of the foolish, and then they think that what they hear on public media is what is happening behind closed doors. I mean, I saw this, for example, in South Africa during the apartheid transition into the liberation, 1994 settlement of government, that Buthelezi, Nelson Mandela, and the ANC, they're all at war on media, and in the evening they're having coffee together. Malema is shouting at Jacob Zuma, but in the afternoon they're having tea together. And they're not permanent friends, they're not permanent enemies. They're just strategic conversations that happen politically. So I think that the politicians are quite cruel in that they have used media, and I'm glad for such spaces like Alpha House and many other podcasters around the world, where an alternative voice, an alternative conversation is allowed to begin to candidly review these kind of policies. But yes, you're right. Maybe Trump has already an agreement of this is how I run things to manage these people. This is how things are going to be.
But there is something I want you to wrap your mind on, because we have had this. Europe said at one time, about 2 weeks ago, that they are very uncomfortable with Africa's apparent neutrality. They would have loved Africa to come out and make a case that this is an unjust war. Do you think that is something that could be in the agenda at Anchorage in Alaska or in the European circles to say, why does Africa in her silence appear to be non-aligned but positively neutral in favor of Russia?
We can candidly say it without mixing words or fear of contradiction, that Russia and China, historically, I speak from the Great Zimbabwe, the Munimutapa, the Phoenicians and the Chinese, we've been doing business with them as early as 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 centuries. Their polystyrene and tools and spoons have been found in the ruins of Great Zimbabwe, that ancient. So the relationship between Zimbabwe and China must not only be understood in the neo-colonialistic space, and even then it must be understood under the abuse of colonization and the struggle of survival post that. IMF, World Banks have closed down the taps of progress and development, and the only hope you have for a singing man is to hold on to a straw. And so we also need to understand the survival conditions which our poor governments have placed themselves, which I might even call it volunteered. They are volunteered to sit on a wheelchair. Because had the money we spend on our weapons and on each other and on splendid living and splashing monies in Dubai, had we turned this into infrastructure, into banking, into job creation, into manufacturing, I can understand. I can understand even the president of Zambia right now, Lungu, dying in South Africa with 360 million worth of cars only, parked outside his house, a palace in Swaziland, lots of this, and you know this is government money, because there's no president who makes money and becomes a millionaire through a government salary. There must be a way in which. So when you look at China and Russia in particular, all our liberation heroes, those that were pro-socialism, Cuba, Russia, China, and North Korea became our training grounds. This is not a secret to anybody. And for us post-liberation, for the Europeans and the Americans to want to demand from us, based on their propaganda, that we should look at the people who helped us into liberation, away from colonization, and deem them as enemies, I think it's a misappropriation.
It is the slave master asking you to hate the one who helped you to escape from slavery.
I used a very, very, very uncomfortable illustration once when I said, how do you come to my house and you rape my daughter? And then you come the following morning with a strategy on how to help them to heal. And then you appoint yourself
as the master
as the
healer,
chief psychological and counselor over the trauma that you caused. I mean, just your presence on its own
is traumatic.
It's trauma. And how the British and Americans want to keep their embassies and their flags within the same boundaries. And this is where I don't understand melanin and our sense of forgiveness and love, that we can still walk in town past a white man, past an Englishman, past a German, and still say, excuse me, with the love and compassion of tolerance.
As it should be.
As if, because this is what humanity is all about.
Hate is the emotion of the weak.
We are stronger than that. So we cannot even begin to listen to America and Europe telling us that Russia is the problem. The problem are Anglo-American companies, multinational companies, that consistently want to use the African ground as a harvesting space of raw material. French is receiving an equal amount of their medicine. When Niger and Mali and Burkina Faso, just a small little thing, just a uranium thing, and she says, okay, you were taking it for $1. Can you, if you want it, can you go on the international market and buy it at the original price? And all of a sudden, the French economy and electricity is catching flu and colds. And this, for me, this is the legitimacy of Russia and China saying, if our governments could say, we don't need money. Please, African government, let me say this on camera. Stop talking money with Russia and China. Start talking industry.
Absolutely.
Manufacturing. Don't think that you have a road, then you say we've developed. This road is for carrying minerals from your country to the border. So you cannot say there's benefit. Yes, there is benefit in terms of people's lives being safe. But a hospital is not development. Building of a parliament is not development. Real development is when people, I define it, when people have access to means of production.
Absolutely.
To develop themselves. We don't need donated houses. We don't need donated cars.
Nyerere put it very well.
We need access to industry. I need to make my own money and I'll develop myself in that direction I want to go. And I think our governments should start talking the right language. Don't go and sign some bilateral agreements of we're going to have buses being imported from Belarus. We're going to have machinery being imported, which are perishables. Say we have bought an industry for producing batteries. We have bought a nuclear reactor to come and produce our local power here. We have bought factories to produce computers here, converting these raw materials into final products. I think that's where employment, that's where GDPs are sitting. And I wish I could have a wake-up call to our African president. Don't say we want money, say we want industry.
I hear you. And I think in this era, as we still tying down the Alaska meeting, there's something to say about Nyerere said something that was very profound. Maendeleo si vitu, ni watu. Development is not things, it is people.
Wow.
And I think that that was deep. And of course, when we talk now about what you are talking about and we talk artificial intelligence, we also say, are we consumers of artificial intelligence?
I've taken that word and owned it.
Yes.
No more as artificial intelligence.
Yes.
I call it ancestral intelligence.
Ancestral intelligence.
That's AI.
Indeed. The Dogons had it. But let us perhaps tie down the Alaska meeting a lot more neatly. Yeah. And I'm thinking of at the end of the meeting, what kind of communique do you envisage from both sides? Or you want to see a situation where there is no joint communique, each party releases its own, and since they have another meeting?
Since we are now dealing with the cyber world, which they call the New World, which America has territory, though it's not Berlin drawn on the paper. Russia has territory, though it's not drawn on paper. Now with these alliances, where each of these superpowers can dot in space their territory in terms of their world, where they have their influence. Maybe all of us who are in the third world and beyond should start looking at, are we going to be standing with Russia? Then we have China and North Korea and BRICS and South America, on our side. Are we going to stand with America? Then we have some of Europe and some of the countries where America has influence. Then you play into the economics of those two worlds that are being created. The American world, idealistic. The Russian world, idealistic. What is the economy of both? What is the population of both? What is the military power of both of them? So maybe at the end of this meeting, actually, if there's any critical thing amongst us, you may want to look at the GDP on the left, the GDP on the right, the military on the left, the military on the right, the powers on the left, the powers on the right, and the influence globally, so that at the end of this meeting, I think it must be put to rest once and for all, that on the left, we have capitalism, and on the right, we have, it's no longer socialism in its purest, but it becomes socialism, sort of, that's a new hybrid sort of thing with its oligarchy structures, which we can talk about on another day. But I think after this meeting, it must be very clear to the rest of the world that either you stand with Trump, with what he represents, or you stand with Russia with what it represents. And I hope it brings an end.
Why must we be standing with either of them? Why can't it be that we, particularly in the African continent, after listening to both sides of the story, are able to come up with what is called the African position on the goings-on?
You are back